Hello, Internet. This is David Rovix hosting another live stream broadcast, which is appearing on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, Cebu Community Radio, and various other platforms. During the pandemic, since I can no longer tour and play music for a living, I've taken to broadcasting every weekday at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT. On Mondays, it's an open mic, which I call Pandemic Open Mic Mondays, which folks are encouraged to sign up to participate in at davidrovix.com/POMM. Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, I've been interviewing my friends for the most part and sort of publicly catching up with people who I might otherwise be hanging out with physically on a typical tour if such things were still happening. On Tuesdays, however, the broadcast has an actual producer, longtime Detroit area talk show host and Fifth Estate magazine editorial collective member Peter Werby. These days, Fifth Estate is a quarterly print magazine that has been published in one form or another since its founding in 1965. You can read the entirety of the spring issue online at fifthestate.org. You can also subscribe to the print magazine there and hear previous episodes of Fifth Estate Live as well at fifthestate.org. June 27th is the 151st anniversary of the birth of the renowned anarchist, organizer, theorist, author, publisher, feminist, and midwife, among many other things, Emma Goldman. For the occasion, we'll be spending the hour today talking with the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, author of the 2011 book Emma Goldman, Political Thinking in the Streets, who maintains an amazing online archive about other anarchist women of Emma Goldman's time period. Kathy Ferguson, welcome to Fifth Estate Live.
Thank you.
And I wonder if we could start out with the sort of massively way too big question that I've been starting out with guests lately, which is just as a historian, as somebody with a whole lot of expertise in a very, very complicated moment in time, are you reminded of any particular historical moments right now, or would you care to take a stab at sort of summarizing the current historical moment we're in?
Well, it's hard not to see the echoes of 100 years ago. Obviously the pandemic is an echo of the 1918 flu, but also the sort of the Gilded Age, the shameless expansion of the 1%. By expansion, I don't mean that more of them, but I mean that they expand what they own, their control of resources and opportunities, the rising gap between the rich and the poor, the political rumblings, the opposition. There were many right at the end of World War I, many sites of labor unrest and of working people contesting the inequality that bore down on them. So yeah, I see some echoes there.
Yeah, more than a few.
And
yeah. So and then jaggedly skipping over to the topic that we are to the fact that it's Emma Goldman's 151st birthday in a few days. Just before we get into a lot of stuff, which is I think very relevant in terms of Emma Goldman's political perspective and useful application of many of her orientation today. Which is maybe a particular interest of mine and many other viewers here, but for a lot of folks out there who have heard the name Emma Goldman and probably been in a cafe called Red Emma's or any number of other things, but really don't know a whole lot about her, can you give us a little introduction? Who was Emma Goldman?
Sure. She was born in 1869. She immigrated from her area of birth, which is in the sort of Russian/German section of the Russian Empire in 1885. Came to New York, went to Rochester. An older sister had preceded her in immigration. She went to Rochester to live with her sister, became a factory worker, briefly was married, was had already encountered some elements of radical thought in Russia with the nihilist movement and the student movements of the time. And Haymarket happened, and Haymarket radicalized Goldman, as it did a whole generation of young anarchists. And she went to New York with her $5 and her sewing machine, and found the anarchist movement and basically never left it. That was her political home for the rest of her life.
You know, one of the things it came across was how the magazine or the newspaper that she started publishing and it became a publisher of is called Mother Earth, which it just occurs to me in the modern context, a lot of anarchists might be surprised to know that one of the most prominent anarchist publications of the early 20th century was called Mother Earth. I wonder, can you talk about that and her?
You mean for the environmental sound to it, the ecological sound to it?
It sounds ecological. It sounds, I guess it became something. I don't know if it was at the time that she was coining the phrase Mother Earth, if it had any of the same connotations back then.
Yeah, not so much. First of all, the first title she wanted for her journal was The Open Road, but she couldn't use that one. That was taken. And I don't think we can read too much contemporary environmental ideas back into Goldman. That really wasn't very available at that time. You know, that like the national park process of creating national parks had started. There was a conservation movement, but it was often pretty right wing. Teddy Roosevelt was a key figure in it. So I think it was more the symbolism of a kind of a creative maternal force. I think it was a little more poetic than it was environmental.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The one of the things that's constantly being talked about in the corporate media today, among many other things that are constantly being talked about, is tactics involving the protests that have been going on all over the place, and especially the media's own peculiar way of defining violence versus nonviolence. And I know that was a lot of the political question of the time of Emma Goldman's life in the early 20th century, late 19th century, was around questions of political violence and the violence being done to the labor movement and many other movements of the time. And I know you write about that. And I just wonder if you could reflect on some of that a bit. This whole question of violence and the propaganda of the deed. And
yeah, well, in Goldman's time, which roughly was the Paris Commune to the Spanish Revolution, she lived a long time, and she was involved with anti-war work, birth control agitation. She worked in the labor movement. As you mentioned, she was an editor and a writer. She was a fabulous orator. She kind of had, it was her idea of what anarchism was about essentially took her into any arena of popular revolt where it looked like ordinary working people were able to contest the power of the particular side of patriarchy, capitalism, Christianity, imperialism that was most oppressive to them. So as you mentioned, the anarchist movement got famous for violence in a somewhat ironic way, since by far the most common tactics of anarchism during this time was education. Anarchists are people of the book. Whether they're atheists or not, they're people of the book. And so producing words and putting words into circulation has always been the thing that anarchists are best at. But there were a sufficient number of high-profile acts of violence against people who were seen as the leaders of oppressive institutions, either heads of states or heads of corporations. That became the thing that anarchism was known for on the side of elites. And it's still, of course, today. I mean, you can't open the paper or have a podcast without seeing somebody in power decrying anarchy in the streets. And, they typically use that to mean chaos. And I look around and I see a lot of anarchy in the streets too. But what I mean is self-organization. That when Occupy happens, or deoccupy as we call it in Hawaii, when indigenous people or feminists or anybody, racial justice protesters, when they make a space that they govern, that's anarchy. So there's a lot of anarchy out there. It's really pretty cool.
And then one of the fascinating things about these, about sort of self-controlled, autonomous zones in so many situations is they can accomplish such great things, but they're always pretty much under siege. In cases like Rojava, and extremely literally, but isn't that the case? I mean, like the autonomous zone in Seattle, the Capitol Hill. The CHOP, they're calling it. There's already been several shootings, one death. Who knows what the circumstances are, why this is happening? But of course, it's being used as an excuse to retake the zone by the police. I don't know if you've been following that particular.
Yeah, I have been following it. I'm very interested in Seattle, not least because my sons live there, but also because the Seattle General Strike of 1919 was a terrific example of anarchy in action.
Where the IWW was basically running the entire city for several days?
Well, it wasn't just the IWW. They were actually a very small part. They were important. They were leaders, but the basically working people of Seattle, both IWW and AFL affiliated unions, ran Seattle for 5 days, and they had they kept order. The one of the generals who was tasked with bringing order went to the city and met with the leadership and looked around and said, "There's already order here. This is a very orderly place." The people who the group of people who were in charge of basically going around and making sure that things were orderly were unarmed, and they it was even the opponents of the general strike in their later writings note how well organized and peaceful those 5 days were in Seattle.
Yeah, and presumably during those 5 days in Seattle, you don't have any of the disorder of police violence and evictions and all this kind. When they talk about order and the kind of disorder that is caused by the state violence, the daily state violence. Yeah. But is it true that I believe? I mean, I don't know. I don't recall seeing somebody summarize it this way. But every general strike that I've ever read about in North American history seems to end with a massacre of strikers. Is that your? I mean, that's what happened in Seattle, right?
No, it didn't. The Seattle general strike did not end in violence.
Nobody was killed by the police?
No.
Okay.
No. They basically went back to work. They met. And they had a general assembly, and out of their general assembly, they elected an executive committee, and the executive committee did a lot of the hourly work of making sure the garbage was collected and making sure that the milk was delivered and the laundry happened and people could get their prescriptions and that the food was created. They fed Seattle in these public kitchens, essentially, where lots of political talk happened. It's where people came to figure out what was going on and what they were going to do. So they were real sites of public discussion. And at the end of 5 days, basically what they said, Anna Louise Strong was one of the leaders of the strike. She was a journalist, and she was the person whose writing is most associated now with the strike. And she basically made a distinction. She said, if you are organizing around a particular issue and your strike is a specific strike that is trying to get a wage increase or better working conditions or a new contract or whatever it is, then she said, then you have to focus on that. And you want everybody in town to know this is what you're trying to accomplish. And these are the people who need to act. And she said, that's one kind of strike. That's a specific strike. A general strike is different. A general strike, it doesn't have an agenda. It's trying to create a world. A general strike is when people say, we could live differently, and here's how. And they, instead of just issuing demands for living differently, they live differently. Mm. And that's often seen as, quote, disorganized by the people who are advocating the specific strike, because they have in mind that you put out a list of demands and then you meet and negotiate and come to an outcome. And Anna Louise Strong said basically, well, that's fine if that's what you're trying to do, but that's not what we're trying to do here. Here, we're trying to show that ordinary working people can run their own lives. And we did. And she said, and after 5 days, we decided, they basically called it off because they knew that there would be a point at which violence would likely happen. But they saw that they basically could make their point about political change and go back to work to carry the impact of that with them before the authorities came down on them. And that's what they did.
In a sense, it sounds to me like something I often run across when I'm trying to interpret historical events, that it's sort of the threat of force or the threat of violence or the potential for what could have happened if the working class continued the general strike. And I mean that can yield powerful results oftentimes. I mean, I think of the rent strike wars of upstate New York in the 1840s. Now for like 9 years nobody paid the rent, but they also and they also showed up to a lot of events. The rent strikers showed up armed, but there weren't, I don't think any shots were actually fired until the 9th year of the strike. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that in terms of like the I guess, you know, Trotsky talks about the dual power. I don't know if, you know, this kind of idea of the potential for how things could go if things really, if there was a real threat to the ruling class or a bigger threat to what was the outcome after 1919? How would you summarize the outcome?
Well, initially there was a lot of momentum with the strike, and the unions were strong, and they either created or kept going a number of cooperatives that had been started. They already had a lot in Seattle. Seattle was a union town. The unions had their own newspaper. They had a public culture of working people's activism. And so they initially, after the strike, that continued to blossom. But a number of things happened within a couple of years to undermine the strike. One is that the federal government came down on labor everywhere. The shipyards, many of the shipyards were closed in Seattle because the war ended and there was not the same need. The government wasn't in the market for ships in the same way that they had been. And also it was more important to control the workers. Marx was right about when capitalists have to choose between profit and control, they pick control because they can get profit later if they have control.
And then this was the Palmer raids and all what was it, what was she not riot, incitement to riot. Emma Goldman got charged with incitement to riot so many times. Huh? This charge.
You're talking about the Alien and Sedition Act.
Yes, that's the Alien and Sedition Act.
Yeah,
that pretty much destroyed so much. It made it impossible to organize, to even publish. Right.
It did. It was the Palmer raids, and before that, the Comstock raids had really shrunk the available space for public words, and then it just kept getting worse. If you remember Goldman and Berkman, I don't know if your listeners know, but Alexander Berkman was Goldman's sort of lifelong colleague and comrade, and also a writer and editor for Mother Earth, and a brilliant organizer and a really exceptional writer. And they were both arrested and convicted under the Alien and Sedition Act for essentially opposing the draft in World War I. And they spent about 2 years in prison and then were deported. And the U.S. government had to strip Goldman of her citizenship in order to deport her, which they did by taking away the citizenship of her long dead husband, and thus, manipulating or kind of maneuvering through the situation to take away her citizenship too. But later radicals were, I can't remember the details of this, but the later radicals were treated even more harshly because they were arrested under increasingly severe laws restricting dissent and sentenced to 10 years in prison, 20 years in prison. In fact, one of the things that anarchists did that I thought is a real example of how historically anarchists have often been leaders in coalitions of socialists, trade unionists, civil libertarians, free speech advocates, to bring an alliance together to focus on a particular issue. And the issue they focused on was the liberation of political prisoners. After World War I, there were lots of people in prison, and Berkman and Goldman were just two of the most famous. Excuse me. And by the mid-20s, most of those people had been let out. And it wasn't because the government decided to be nice. It's because there was a really coordinated campaign for the release of political prisoners, and it was effective.
And the scale of the campaigns around the release of political prisoners at the time, I mean, I just think, I'm not sure if people can even picture how big these campaigns were, and also the amount of money that was raised in these campaigns is just even in contemporary dollars. I was reading about some of the campaigns around folks, Italian American anarchists in New York, and how much. I mean, tens of thousands of people showed up to the funerals of folks who were accused of plotting to bomb prominent politicians and arrested for it. And then when they I can't remember which now. See, my memory. I hope this also happens to other people who are experts on various subjects, that they just forget everything they just read. But really tremendous. It was a huge movement, and I wonder if can you paint us a picture of just how extensive the movement was back then?
Yeah, I can try. like, let's draw back a little bit. We've been really focused on the post-World War I era, but if you look from the Paris Commune to the Spanish Revolution, it had some ups and downs, and there would be like in the 20s and early 30s, American anarchists were often saying, "Oh my God, our movement's dying." And of course, the older generation was getting older. They couldn't help that. But movement wasn't dying. It was morphing. It was changing. Younger anarchists were coming along. They were being radicalized by the Spanish Revolution, by the rise of fascism, by the economic catastrophes of the late 20s and 30s. It was a vigorous global movement, and it never really went away. The idea that it has an end, that's not true. What it does is it kind of dips, and there's a period of time, basically, kind of common sense would tell you that when fascism is strong, anarchism is under attack. That fascists go after anarchists. And one way they do it is by calling everybody an anarchist, but also just by really targeting the people who are enabling self-organization on the part of ordinary people. But the idea that anarchism ended after World War I, or even after World War II, what happened was under assault, because that's when you tend to have red scares, is when the both after World War I and after World War II, when you've got this highly organized group of people, of working people, who've been told for 4 years, we're all in it together. We have to pull together to fight the war. We have to defeat the enemy. We're all Americans, we're all Brits, we're all whatever. And then the war ends, then all of a sudden the class war's back. And they say, well, wait a minute, what happened to we're all in this together? And so labor issues and popular issues tend to be voiced at strongly at those times, among other times. And what the Red Scare of both post-war eras harmed anarchism for sure. It was a setback. You can't have all those people put in jail, executed, thrown into exile, all those publications squashed. That's going to harm a movement, but it didn't eliminate the movement. And many of the people that I spent a lot of time reading, people like Goldman, but also Rudolf Rocker, who was an anarchist leader and a friend of Goldman's, who spent the last 20 or so years of his life in the United States. He lived at Mohegan Colony in upstate New York. And he died in 1958. And he just before the resurgence of anarchism of the late 60s and 70s. So he didn't see that coming. But we can see, looking back, that when anarchism seems to be repressed beyond recovery, that's just a moment in time, and it comes back.
Mm. And I mean, how much of repression back then? I mean, I guess it's so hard to disentangle everything, but I guess that's kind of your job. But like, how much of the repression was part of what happened to the sort of ebbing of the anarchist movement for a certain number of decades, and how much of it was the attraction of socialism and the because it seems like I know a lot of people whose family histories were like, yeah, great grandpa was an anarchist and then grandma was a socialist, and these things there was a lot of back and forth there.
Yeah, well, that used to be a pretty porous before 1917. That was a pretty porous boundary. between anarchism and socialism. And I have to say, I appreciate very much that you called me a historian. That makes my sense of myself smile. But I have to say that by training, I'm a political theorist. And so many people who are historians by training would probably find my willingness to generalize about themes to be too ready. His political theorists tend to look for that big picture, and historians tend to be much more, in the nitty gritty. And I try to be both, but I recognize that historians have a special contribution. I also have to say, just to set the record straight, I'm no longer the chair of my department. I have a wonderful chair and our department has a very strong interest in the contemporary anarchist work that's happening among Indigenous people because of our new leadership. So I recognize that as important, and it's not me.
Yeah, good. Wikipedia needs an update, but that's not unusual.
No.
I looked on your university page too, but I didn't see anything about you not being the chair. But I suppose that it wouldn't say that. It would, yeah. When you're talking about the some of the what happened, we were all in this together. I mean, of course, it sounds so much like you're talking about the present moment, and I just gotta. I mean, when I remember hearing one statistic that the children of Britain ate better during the Second World War than they did before or since in the 20th century, because food was actually distributed. It was rationed, and I mean, this we're all in this together to fight a war kind of thing, and then suddenly we find that there is all this money available, and all these austerity budgets, and all these evictions, and all this homelessness, all this poverty might not have been just an inevitable consequence of the system functioning well or something. And I just I mean, it's a terrible thing to ask anybody, any intellectual, to make any predictions. But I mean, this is quite a moment, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's remarkable and hopeful that the level of public involvement right now in combating racism and in not letting go of it it warms a person's heart to see the bravery of the young people who are leading these protests, the Black Lives Matter groups and their allies. And there's a lot of anarchy happening out there, and without, I'm not saying that necessarily is the heart of every organization, but when you look at what they do, the empowerment of communities is I think one of the most exciting things that's happening right now.
And it seems like reading the corporate press, they try to put a fairly positive spin on things as much as they can, as far as like the state of the economy. But it looks like things are going to get a lot worse, as bad as they are now, and there's so many potential. I mean, the wave of evictions is something they're talking about a lot on the corporate press as well, and yeah, I just wonder, this movement that's in the streets now, this large scale multiracial movement that's happening right now. I wonder what it's all, what it's all about. Like, because I mean, obviously George Floyd was the spark that set off this powder keg, but it's yeah, I don't know. It's not that you should know the answer to this question, but I'm very intrigued by in relation to the Seattle general strike and the idea of autonomous control and rent strikes and people taking over buildings. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on strategies. Like, I mean, there were a lot of rent strikes along with the general strikes in the early 20th century as well.
Yeah, that's true. But I can't really say that I have a great insight into strategies. But what I do think is there are certain moments where it's hard to unlearn something. I think it's going to be very hard for a lot of people in the world to unlearn the racism of police violence. And it's going to be hard for newspapers to not notice another young Black man or woman killed by police. It's going to be that. I think it's going to be hard to take that one back. And I think then that's an arena to build on.
Right, because I mean, because it's police violence is so fundamental to the control of the society, isn't it? I mean, it's just the subject of defunding the police is talked about in mainstream circles now, and it's I don't know, I think people do realize what a radical idea it is, which is why so many people on the media are so terrified of even talking about it, but they kind of have to now. But I wonder, I don't know if you have any particular thoughts on the radicalism of this idea and where this could potentially go, or what people might do with this idea.
Well, to me, the most hopeful part of that is the focus on police training. Yes, of course, the chokeholds should be banned, but they were banned before and it didn't stop it. I mean, some places they were banned and it didn't stop it. And of course, they shouldn't have military weaponry and so forth. But I really think the key is reorganizing the relationship between police and communities, and that's police training. If police are seen as community guardians, if they know people in their police, if they in their communities, if they patrol on foot patrols, and community knowledge and trust are not impossible to develop, but they can't be based on arms. And they can't be based on the idea that police are warriors. Police have to be protectors for everybody.
But and then getting back to history, that's not the history of police departments, is it? I mean, when we look at the history of the anarchist movement, Emma Goldman, so much of what you've written about, I mean, the police are there to defend the capitalists primarily, right?
Well, as long as property is more important than people, then yes, that's what police are doing. But I do think it's not impossible. There have been some reforms where the training of police was different. I don't think they ever stopped defending property. That I wouldn't go that far. But where the idea of how police were trained, like the idea that they would understand something about mental illness, so that they would have a repertoire of possible reactions to someone who, say, doesn't stop when told to stop, would be more than kill them. And so I think it is not impossible to think of this moment as a time to rethink what police are.
I know you've traveled and studied in other countries, and in particular, I've noticed that in Austria and in Sweden, and both countries where you don't see a lot of police around generally. And it always, one of the things about traveling, it always strikes me that other societies are so different, and where are all the police? And then when you do see them, they're not carrying guns unless there's gun crime happening, which is so rare. And in which case, then you suddenly see a bunch of very heavily armed police when there's gun crime. It's I wonder. I know that we're straying far from Emma Goldman, but in your travels, has that particularly had an impact just on your perspective living in different societies?
I just spent 6 months in London, and I was in quarantine most of the time. But in terms of just watching YouTube videos, I noticed sometimes you could actually see the police's face and how that's a difference when they look like ordinary people wearing regular clothes, and then they'll have vests on over it, but and sometimes they're dressed as riot police. That's not always the case, but often I thought how different it is to think of police as human, and because their bodies and their faces showed as human, as opposed to sort of robotized.
Yeah, that reminds me of when my teenage daughter, when I introduced her to the movie E.T., when she was sort of old enough to, the extraterrestrial, Steven Spielberg, and there's this scene where the evil government authorities are coming to do something to E.T., and what makes them so scary in the movie is that you can't see their faces. And that's clearly the whole effect of the riot, sort of the hazmat suits they're wearing. It's just you can't see their faces. I just wonder also, I know that you got a PhD at the University of Minnesota in the 70s, and I wonder if you what was your it was quite a period to be studying in Minnesota. There was quite a active social movements going on at the time, and what was can you just give us some impressions of Minneapolis in the 70s?
Well, one thing that I loved about Minneapolis was the strength of the co-op movement there. Food co-ops were a big part of the food scene in Minneapolis, and there were a lot of them, and they had a network, and they had publications. They had an active volunteer organization, so that people were part of the store. They were democratically elected. They were. I loved the co-ops there, and I also was first introduced to indigenous political organizing there, because I had never lived in a place where I was aware of that. Could be that I just wasn't aware, but I hadn't. And I go to Minneapolis, and there's Native American organizing going on. There's programs of different kinds. There's spaces being claimed and being created around Native American cultural practices and political issues and communities. And those were the two things. When I thought of Minneapolis, I thought of co-ops and indigenous peoples organizing. And so to think of it now as a place of such racist police action, it shook my, I'd been gone for a long time, and I hadn't really kept up with the local politics there at all, but it was an abrupt interruption of my own memory.
When we're talking about people like Anna Louise Strong and Emma Goldman, and your this amazing archive that's it's hosted by the University of Hawaii, is it the archive? And I know I don't know how well you can even necessarily answer this question definitively, but why is Emma Goldman? Why does Emma Goldman become such a relatively well-known historical figure, and these hundreds and hundreds of some very prominent women who organized all kinds of campaigns and are basically completely forgotten?
That's a great question. That's really what I'm writing about now in one of my current projects. Is I think there's several reasons for that. One is that the history of feminism has kind of congealed around the history of suffrage, to the point where periodically somebody will tell me, well, Emma Goldman wasn't a feminist. And what they mean by that is she wasn't a suffragist. Well, no, she wasn't. She was an anarchist. And so, of course, she wasn't arguing in favor of voting as the primary vehicle for change. She specifically says she thinks it's just as reasonable that women should have the vote as that men should have the vote. Her argument is she's not coming at this from the right. She's coming at it from the left. Her argument is that, as she said many times, if voting could change things, they'd make it illegal. And that may be wrong. I think we really ought to revisit voting in light of contemporary problems. But she was a feminist in a different way. And so I think part of the reason that Emma Goldman is well known, but the other hundreds and hundreds of anarchist women that I have found in my research are not well known, is that the history of women's organizing has shrunk around the history of suffrage. And so women who were doing union organizing, who were organizing birth control clinics, or who were part of various sorts of free speech or anti-war organizations have been shoved aside. So I think that's one thing, it's just the way we tell feminist history has become narrow. A second thing is just the way we remember tends to be individuated. And what's a few outstanding people who are either demonized or lionized stand out, but the history of the movement that enabled them fades. And so to me, one of the things that we really need from our radical historians is to recover anarchism as a movement, not just as a few colorful people. And so why those people? Why do we remember them? Well, it's partly because their work stays in print. So Kropotkin's never gone out. Well, maybe he went out for a while, but he's back in print. And Proudhon's in print, and Bakunin and Goldman and Berkman are in print, and Rudolf Rocker. And so there's a host of Landauer, Gustav Landauer, like the sort of the top 10, Malatesta, who it's not hard to go online or anywhere into any library and find their writings. And so they come to stand for, in a way that they would have never accepted. When you look at Goldman, Malatesta, Rocker, Kropotkin, they all said the movement is at the grassroots. We are well known because we write and publish, but the real movement is the people who are making the journals happen, the printers, the distributors, the illustrators, the people selling the journals on the street, people coming back doing it all again next week, over and over, year after year after year. That's where the movement is.
Because like each one of these journals like had thousands or tens of thousands of paid subscribers, right? And along with people distributing the newspapers. And I mean, when you think about the whole process, all that was involved with putting out a publication like that, so much more than the writers and the publisher.
Yeah, it was a huge network, and 10,000 would be a lot for an anarchist journal. One of the things that one of the ways I like to say this in a joking way is when new socialists come to town, they subscribe to existing socialist papers. So the masses had, or Appeal to Reason, were big socialist publications with maybe 100,000 subscribers. When new anarchists come to town, they start their own journal. And so any one journal might have 3,000, 4,000, 6,000 subscribers, but they had a lot more readers than that, because these were by and large poor people. And so they passed the journal around. So the family that subscribed would literally read it out loud at the dinner table to everybody, and then give it to the neighbors who would do the same thing. And also I really enjoy imagining how we could do this again, that when you went into a pub, a cafe, a bar, a restaurant, there'd be a lot of them that had that clientele would have anarchist literature. You could read Mother Earth while you waited for your ham and eggs. And so or drank your beer. And so the presence of these publications far exceeded the relatively small number that were produced, because of the way that they were shared and distributed. And also your point about production, that's really important. That's a second project I'm working on now, is looking at the importance of printers in the anarchist movement. There were lots and lots of printers, in the anarchist movement. And again, remember, I'm talking mostly about the period of time from the Paris Commune to the Spanish Revolution. So essentially, it's Emma Goldman's lifetime, 1870. She was born in 1869 to about 1940. And I started noticing that there were lots of printers. And in fact, the historian Barbara Tuchman, in her book, This Proud Tower, notices there are lots of anarchists who are printers. I wonder why, she says. Was it because printers became anarchists, or was it because anarchists became printers? She said, I don't know. And she went on. But I'm kind of dwelling with that question.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in how not just reading, but making the publications was part of the glue that held the anarchist movement together. And so it was the physicality of printing. It was the intimacy with the press. It was the smell, the feel, the material energy that came from that particular skilled work, which was both quintessentially working class, but also highly educated. So I really think that one thing that says to me about politics, if I'm right, and if the making of the journals was an important glue, and it was a strongly material relationship between people and their tools and each other, then maybe that tells us that to keep radical politics going, people need to be doing something together with their hands. People need to be making things together. And when I look at, for example, indigenous organizing, often it's the making of a physical space. On Mauna Kea, where the Native Hawaiians have tried to have successfully stopped the desecration of the mountain by the building of another telescope, the protectors there, one of the things they do that I think is so powerful politically is they make a space for their activism, a physical space. Another group, Food Not Bombs, I think the making of the food, the actual, we are together here making and distributing food, I think that's more than just a means to an end. That's an end in itself. And when I look at the success of many of these journals, as well as other things that anarchists did. Anarchists, seems to me, were good at three things. They were good at publications, they were good at unions, and they were good at schools. And those are all, there's a strong physicality to those things. You do things with your body. And I really think that's something we need to learn from our study of the history of this movement.
And it seems like taking over physical spaces and holding on to them in the center of a town is often central to any kind of social movement. Tahrir Square, Occupy Wall Street. Yeah.
And it requires a lot of creativity that is intellectual and physical at the same time. Like, I think the creative human microphone in the Occupy Wall Street was a good example. Just the, getting enough bicycles to produce power when the authorities came and took away your generators. The actual making of a space where the materiality of life goes on. That's a site of creativity.
Yeah. The community gardens, the squat. I mean, what I find as having been of the generation that was young in the 1980s, like the squatting movement in New York City and throughout Europe in the 80s, holding physical space like that and then doing all sorts of stuff with it. The movement was so often, and still is so often, derided by so many aspects of the mainstream culture and also the parts of the left as being sort of I don't know, just obsessed with culture or something. I don't know the way it's often dismissed as being, just a bunch of people smoking pot together or in the squat and not working or whatever. But it's so much not like that, and it's such an important challenge to the whole question of property relations and gentrification. I don't know if that's a particular iteration of this taking of space that you've got any particular background in, but that's
well, not so much that those particular things, although I think you're right that the um, squatting is often an opportunity to make a community space. It has necessarily a physicality to it. When I look at back at Goldman, another side of this sort of physical dimension of politics that's very important to her was reproduction. That I mentioned that some contemporary commentators have suggested she wasn't a feminist because she wasn't a suffragist, but Goldman's feminism was very much focused on women's bodies, reproductive bodies, laboring bodies, pregnant bodies, growing from childhood to adult bodies. And that, I think, is an important part of contemporary feminism too, and shows the kind of a link when you look at the history. Like Goldman was one of the first to advocate publicly for birth control. Margaret Sanger gets all the credit, but she was mentored by Goldman. And she was initially an anarchist. Her first journal, The Woman Rebel, was an anarchist journal.
Does she get all the credit because when because she no longer was an anarchist by the time she is that basically because it's Emma Goldman becomes too complicated a character to sort of in a way to be getting credit for a lot of things, because she wasn't just a feminist or just an anarchist. I mean, she embodied so many different topics.
I think that's true. She was doing intersectionality a long time ago,
right?
Before we had a word for what it meant to always intertwine different vectors of power and see them in relationship to one another.
Also, she played a prominent role in so many different periods of history. That also, I wonder if that becomes a harder person to then sort of summarize or character. Although it doesn't seem to hurt her in terms of her notoriety today necessarily.
No, but again, she's the only one, right?
Right.
Most people have only heard of one anarchist feminist, and it's Emma Goldman. And if they heard of two, the second one is Voltairine de Cleyre. And if they've heard of three, the third one is Lucy Parsons, and then we're done.
Right.
And whereas there were hundreds of them. And just to say one more thing about the Margaret Sanger Emma Goldman relationship, I really think that when we look back at the history of birth control, what we see is that for the anarchists, birth control was important because it was part of a constellation of overlapping issues that had to do with popular power. That for anarchists, women should control their own bodies, their own reproduction, in the same way that workers should control their own labor and soldiers should control their own fighting. That it was part of a sort of radically egalitarian approach to human freedom. And what Sanger did that allowed birth control to become mainstreamed in a sense, although not entirely, is that she took it out of that radical context where it was about women's freedom and put it into a context where it's about women's health. And it becomes something that doctors control and that women go to doctors to get. And that's become the progressive position, that, birth control is between me and my physician. But that was not the progressive position 100 years ago. The radical position on birth control was that it's got to do with my freedom.
Yeah. Well, somehow or other, it's been an hour, so I just say thank you so much, Kathy Ferguson, for joining us for the hour, and I hope the conversation hasn't been too terribly disjointed, but it was really great having you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank
you.
And
thank you to Fifth Estate.
Yeah. Thanks to Peter Warby, producer out there listening somewhere in Detroit. Yes, Fifth Estate. Yeah, good. See you again, Kathy. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And thanks for tuning in to this discussion with Kathy Ferguson on Fifth Estate Live, which you can hear every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, KBOO Community Radio, and elsewhere. You'll find all the Fifth Estate Live episodes at fifthestate.org, where you can also subscribe to the physical magazine or read the latest edition online. You can also find these interviews and my other interviews archived in various places in the Discussions with David playlist at youtube.com/drovics and in audio form at soundcloud.com/davidrovics, at patreon.com/davidrovics, where you can also support my broadcasting efforts and check out lots of other content. Or if you look for This Week with David Rovics on any podcasting platform. Tomorrow, I'll be talking with longtime Portland organizer with Jobs with Justice, Portland Tenants United, and many other networks, and regular contributor to Counterpunch and other publications, Seamus Cook. Remember, don't pay the rent and don't be afraid of your neighbors. Mutual aid will get us through. See you soon.